Good morning. A strong motivator for me came from a simple question and the reactions to it. Dr. Robin DiAngelo, an anti-racist educator, asked the people of color in the room, what would it be like if you could simply give us, white people, feedback on our unaware yet inevitable racism, have us graciously receive it, reflect, and work to change the behavior? The looks of disbelief and wonder on the faces of my colleagues of color spoke volumes. They could not imagine this happening, but it would be wonderful if it did. Later, she prompted white folks, if you have never gotten feedback that what you said or did was racially problematic, consider why not. I had never gotten feedback that what I said or did was racially problematic. She ended with, if you choose to do nothing, then you must look yourself in the mirror and say, I am okay with racism. This felt really shocking to me at the time. This occurred in February of 2016 when Robin DiAngelo discussed, what does it mean to be white? Developing white racial literacy. I can tell you the date because I keep the flyer on my bulletin board to remind me. She presented a lecture and seminars at Peabody College at Vanderbilt University, where I'm a faculty member. These set of seminars, and really watching my colleagues of color and how they responded to it, inspired me to set a goal to improve my racial literacy. This meant I would say yes to opportunities as often as possible. I would read and listen, and I would reflect. Today, I'm going to share my journey and experiences on my path towards accountability and how I can work to more appropriately share my resources. It makes me very uncomfortable to do so, but I've been inspired by others and recognize the importance of personal stories. My commitment to say yes and show up at opportunities to improve my racial literacy was critical. I began, like many white people, wanting to know what I could do to improve racial equity. And the consistent message I got was the need to start with my own racial literacy. I didn't like this answer because there was not enough action involved, but I accepted it and I began the work. We have many, many choices of how to spend our time, so setting an intentional goal made a big difference for me. It led me to participate in the church's anti-racism program, the Nashville Pledge, which required committing to 4 Saturdays attending the program, which I felt was a huge time commitment as a working mom. It's why I went to Debbie Irving's talk, Waking Up White, at Harpeth Hall Academy in January of 2020, when Jenny Wolfe McLemore invited me. And Debbie Irving's talk demonstrated the importance to me of sharing personal stories and inspired me to try to share my own. It's why I led or joined several anti-racist book discussions, including one of Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, organized by NOAA. It's why I prioritize and show up to each Widening the Circle of Concern session at our church. And it's why I agreed to give the sermon today. As I built my racial literacy, I reflected back. Raised in Pennsylvania, I insisted that racism was much worse in the South than the North for many years. It was a problem down there in the South, not really a problem where I lived. I believed in the American dream that with hard work you can get ahead, and I was naive because folks I knew could advance through hard work. I was raised using a colorblind perspective, and I believed I was not racist because I did not commit acts of hate or discrimination, or at least I did not perceive that I did. Implicitly, I thought of race as a biological concept defined by genetics. I didn't think critically about this, or I didn't update my notion when scientific evidence clearly indicated there were no race genes. And I think back to the time when I approached a person of color in our congregation about discussing Robin DiAngelo's book. I was really taken aback when she suggested I would organize and take action on this discussion, not her. I didn't yet realize that I was the person who needed to do the work. I began to realize how little of my country's history I really knew. A few examples among many is that redlining was done by the US government, which directed public and private capital to native-born white families and away from African American and immigrant families. I did not know about Black Wall Street or the Tulsa race massacres of 1921, when mobs of white people looted and set fire to African American businesses and homes in a prosperous era. I did not know that white women, such as myself, have benefited the most from affirmative action. I learned much more about the bravery, persistence, and risks of civil rights leaders that had really been whitewashed for me, and the level of hatred, violence, and resistance they faced. But today I draw hope and inspiration from them that they kept going despite it. I also realized that American figures I once idolized had much more complex histories. I attended the University of Virginia, and Thomas Jefferson was the founder, and we were really taught to revere Jefferson, and I revered him especially more because of his connections to Unitarianism. Then when I read in my alumni magazine, Jefferson's belief in the necessity of abolition was intertwined with his racial beliefs. He thought that white Americans and enslaved blacks constituted two separate nations who could not live together peacefully in the same country. Jefferson's belief that blacks were racially inferior and as incapable as children, coupled with slaves' presumed resentment of their former owners, made their removal from the United States an integral part of Jefferson's emancipation scheme. My lack of knowledge of history extended to Unitarian Universalism. I was raised as a UU, and I had a false narrative about UUs and why there were so few Black people who were members. I found this 2017 article in the UUA World by Dr. Morrison Reed, The Black Hole in the White UU Psyche, really eye-opening. I'm going to read you a few excerpts, but I really encourage you to look it up. His message was that this faith that you love has said over and over, sometimes in words, but more often in deeds, Black lives don't matter. He notes a 1956 survey indicating that 60 years ago, nearly 10% of Unitarian congregations had African American members holding positions of leadership. But African Americans were invisible in UU scholarship. Their absence reflected the belief and contributed to the belief that there was no story to tell. Yet African Americans had been founding members of Universalist, Unitarian, and UU congregations as early as 1785. Today, we see the lack of Black leaders confirming the belief that Unitarian Universalism does not appeal to African Americans. But why don't we know the history? The consequence is that we have embraced a false narrative about who we are. He asks, suppose that the funds had been forthcoming in 1911 when Joseph Fletcher Jordan asked Universalists to support plans to add a seminary to the African American school he ran in Suffolk, Virginia. The graduates might have fanned out across the South to preach the gospel of the larger hope, God's all-embracing love. They needed $6,000 for this endeavor. Jordan traveled around the Northeast in 1911 and 1912 raising money, but in the end he raised less than $1,500. To put this in context, in April 1890, the Universalists began a mission in Japan. The Japanese mission was given at least $6,000 a year, often more. During the same years, the Universalists could not raise $6,000 for their mission to the colored people. What does it suggest? It suggests that Black lives don't matter. And I've learned through widening the circle that fun is not exempt from this history. If you dig into our church history, you'll find documents from the Jim Crow era saying that Black people would not be allowed to join our church. Combined with my growing knowledge of our nation and our church's true history, I began to realize more fully how much harder it was to be a Black person in America. Living while Black, driving while Black, jogging while Black, birding while Black, grilling while Black. My reality as a white person is not the same reality as a person of color. I began to recognize the cumulative advantages for me of being white. My ancestors were granted citizenship because they were white. My grandparents were given federally backed mortgages because they were white, and this allowed them to build assets. Normal and American aligned with my European American background. I was steered to particular neighborhoods that were almost all white when buying a home, and those homes increased substantially in value. Indeed, as Robin DiAngelo noted, I do not need to be racist to benefit from a system that has given advantages to me and my family because of our race. My openness about talking about race led some people of color to occasionally feel comfortable sharing their personal experiences with me. I'd like to think they were no longer worried that I might try to minimize or offer alternative explanations to explain their experiences. Sharing things like, my friend would have been arrested several times if he was Black. As a white man, people didn't search his car when he was pulled over with drugs in the trunk. Or, I never understood why Band-Aids were labeled flesh color. They were not my flesh color. Or to be honest, the centering of white families as the norm in child development textbooks really grates on me. To which I responded, of course it grates on you, but I did not recognize that for many, many years of my teaching. And after the killing of a protester at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, a Black friend of mine's reaction to my despair about the events was, in this case, he was less disturbed because the law was doing the right thing in this case. I began to confront narratives and biases that I had implicitly developed. These things were not taught to me, but we make inferences. So when I need to try to understand this achievement gap between white and Asian students versus Black and brown students, I hadn't really thought carefully about it, but I once focused on things like those poor students whose parents don't do all the many things my parents do to help me, and never once considered, wow, what advantages are being given to people like me? What opportunity hoarding are white families engaging in that help benefit their white children? It's helped me appreciate how much our society cultivates an association between Black men and criminality. The data is humbling. I cannot just trust my instincts because they have been shaped by this. 7 years later, I have greatly improved my racial literacy, and while it is a lifelong journey, my journey has compelled me to work to be accountable to marginalized communities and to share my resources more broadly. Because how you spend your time and resources reflects your values. This is what compelled me to join NOAA, Nashville Organized for Action and Hope. I realized I had always been in white-led spaces. And NOAA is still a predominantly white organization, but it has very strong Black leadership and a commitment to anti-racism. They let members of color guide priorities, and it's let me go into a relationship where I listen to people of color and lift up and advocate for what they want. One of those things is that I attend and speak at school board meetings. I learned that it is critical that white folks, especially well-educated white person like myself, to speak out against the inequities Black and brown students face in our school system. They do not have the same opportunities that my children have experienced in MMPS. It's caused me to step up to be a Tennessee Promise mentor for Tennessee students attending attending community college, many of whom are first-generation college students. It compels me to spend some of my work, time, and effort focused on equity, diversity, and inclusion, including my sharing my own journey to recognizing my whiteness, leading an EDI book discussion club, and regularly attending another EDI discussion group. It helped me recognize that the profits from the sale of our first home in Nashville after 20 years of ownership was much greater because we are white, living in a predominantly white neighborhood. According to a 2018 report from the Brookings Institution, owner-occupied homes in majority Black neighborhoods are undervalued by $48,000 per home on average. This compelled me to donate a small portion of the profits to the Housing Fund based in Nashville that provides resources and creative leadership to help individuals and communities in Tennessee create and maintain affordable and healthy places in which low and moderate income people live. It's caused me to grapple with whether I want to be named in my parents' will to receive inheritance after their death. The Black-white wealth gap is staggering, and especially this gap is driven by gaps in generational wealth. Our country's racist policies and actions are a major contributor to the much greater generational wealth in white families such as mine. At the same time, I have the privilege of considering donating any inheritance in part because of my whiteness, because of the job and income that I and my husband have been able to secure. Sure, I work hard, but so many other people work hard and are compensated with so much less. I am grateful and proud that our church and the UUA is also working towards being more accountable. Accountability to me is an explicit commitment to become anti-oppressive and equitable. It requires a fuller understanding of history and modern culture and the systemic biases that are cultivated in our society and which we tend to adopt without much awareness. It requires us to share our resources, investing in relationships with and regular donations of time and financial resources to partners serving to correct past injustices. And it is necessary to serve the full diversity of our community, and thus, I think it is necessary for our church to thrive. We can only do better if we commit to doing the work with accountability, to having the humility to listen to what Black, Indigenous, and people of color, LGBTQ folks, people with disabilities, and other marginalized people tell us, to respond as Robin DiAngelo imagined, rather than trying to focus on intentions, to offer alternative explanations, or to downplay the experiences, to graciously receive it, reflect, and work to change the behavior. We must share our resources and view the sharing not as charity, but as an effort to help right past injustices. I believe the future of our church and our community depends on it. Thank you.